The Thinkpad P1, and formerly the X1 Extreme, has always been the form over function part of the Thinkpad family, an extension of the X1 Carbon form factor into the workstation foray to compete with the likes of the Dell XPS 15. Now, with the P1 in its 7th generation and Lenovo bringing out a controversial third design iteration, is the brand new P1 G7 any good? Starting with the build quality. If you held a previous generation P1 or X1 Extreme, you'll find the P1 G7 to be quite excellent, but not as sturdy as the smaller 13 and 14-inch TNX series ThinkPads because of its larger chassis. Keep in mind I currently have a skin and screen protector applied over my unit. Lenovo has also shrunken the P1 G7 to be shorter than its predecessors, making it just a little bit more portable. The communications bar, or the notch, is now introduced in the P1 family's design, and despite poking out of the laptop when fully closed, also means you have a convenient handle to open the display. Speaking of the display, despite Lenovo making the display a nice, smooth metallic finish, they have kept the chassis the same matte magnesium design akin to the previous generations, meaning the laptop almost looks Frankenstein together when closed up, but is not really a big issue during actual daily use. For the specs, my model has the Core Ultra 7 156H, the RTX 4070 laptop, 32GB of LPCAMM2 memory, and the 1600p 165Hz display. You can configure your device to have anything from a Core Ultra 5 that's iGPU only, to a Core Ultra 9 for slightly higher clocks compared to the Core Ultra 7 models. During configuration, you can also select the amount of memory, which by default is 16GB for the P1 G7. The SSD from the factory was a 1TB SK Hynix PC801, which is the OEM version of the P41 Platinum, also known as the Solidum P44 Pro. I've also installed a 1TB Samsung PM981 from a different laptop into the second slot. Wi-Fi is an Intel BE700. It's unfortunately soldered, but at least it's Wi-Fi 7. My unit came out to a total of $2,170 before tax with some discounts and coupon codes, which is already a steep price on its own, but the official MSRP for this is actually $4,830. Your discounts will vary significantly, therefore it's always advisable to wait for a big sale for prices to drop when buying a new ThinkPad. Before we move forward, let me mention memory pricing. Lenovo prices the upgrade from 16GB to 32GB at $250, and from 16GB to 64GB at $509. These prices, however, are subject to discount codes and, in reality, nowhere near the sticker price, making it potentially cheaper to buy more memory up front instead of speccing your laptop with a stock 16GB and then buying LPCAMM2 modules from Crucial. As with less traditional ThinkPad form factors, the P1 G7 has a reduced travel keyboard. For people who enjoy the pre-chiclet ThinkPad keyboards, this will never come close to that, but for me, it's something that's pretty easy to get used to, especially once you swap the function and control key around. You're going to be stuck with the Copilot key that was formerly print screen, but you can always use, say, Windows Power Toys to remap that key into something more useful. For some reason, this keyboard feels a little bit loud compared to some of the other lower travel ThinkPad keyboards I've used, but maybe this one just needs a bit of a break in time. You might be wondering what Lenovo did with the function and control key. Like the ThinkPad Z16 that first swapped back the control and the function key, Lenovo has kept both of the keys the same size, meaning if you're somebody who's used to the OG layout, all you need to do is pry up and remove both keycaps with the guitar pick and boom. That's exactly what I did with my P1 G7. Lenovo, interestingly, has also added little extrusions on the function, enter, insert, function 2, and function 3 keys, most likely for accessibility purposes. On to the trackpad, or the inglorious return of the infamous Clunkpad. Unlike the haptic trackpad introduced with the first generation Z series ThinkPads, the Senso trackpad on the P1 G7 is similar to the haptic trackpads found on the second generation Z series. It has a lot more haptic feedback and has a much nicer surface, and it's something I was able to get used to pretty quickly and feels much more comfortable to use compared to the Z16 Gen 1. I'm not saying it's a good substitute for dedicated buttons, however, as they did encounter some weird software glitches related to the palm rejection that Lenovo definitely needs to work out via drivers and firmware updates. This is a bit of a bad news for a trackpoint user, but rather good news for somebody who doesn't know what a trackpoint is and would rather prefer the larger trackpad size. If you want to fully experience how buggy the drivers of the trackpad can be, try to use the trackpoint while having the sensor trackpad settings open. This will cause the haptics to respond very erratically. Thankfully, daily use is nowhere like that. Ports remain largely unchanged compared to the earlier body style. The left side featuring the DC power jack, two Thunderbolt 4 ports, the HDMI port, and the headphone jack. On the right side, one of the USB-A ports have been converted into a USB-C port that supports charging, display output, and 10 gigabits per second data. Lenovo has still kept one of the 5 gigabits per second USB-A port, as well as the full-size SD card slot. A major upgrade this year is the SD card fits fully flush, unlike the last design iteration where the SD card sticks out. Unfortunately, Lenovo giveth and Lenovo taketh away. A major hidden downgrade is Lenovo integrating the power jack onto the motherboard. In the previous two iterations of the P1 physical designs, the power jack has had its own connector to the motherboard, meaning in the future, if your charger wore out your power port, you can just simply replace the jack. With the P1 G7, however, either you need to learn how to solder a replacement power jack or it's straight to a new motherboard for you, which is an unfortunate backward step in repairability. The display is excellent. I'm using a matte screen protector, but 165Hz refresh rate makes this thing nice and smooth. You can also conserve power and lower it down to 60Hz, but I would have liked to see Lenovo do something similar to their Legions, where you can use a keyboard shortcut to switch between refresh rates. Alternatively, setting that automatically switches to 60Hz when on battery and 165Hz when plugged in. I cannot test how good exactly my panel is, but based on hardware info, it's using BOE's NE160QDM-NY1, which seems to be used by both Lenovo and Acer on their 1600p 165Hz panels. Speakers are, well, fine. Lenovo has stuck around with a dual speaker setup, and it's good enough for government work despite it now being downwards firing. Just curb your expectations, they're nowhere near a MacBook Pro. Given that this is the first P1 model to not include WAN, it feels like there's a bit of wasted space that Lenovo could have put two extra speakers, but who knows? If the X1 Carbon 6th and 7th Gen was any indication, maybe Lenovo's sandbagging here, and we'll see a quad speaker version of this sometime down the line. Lenovo has kept the battery the same capacity at 90 watt-hours, but switched to a more press-down connector similar to the T14 and the X1 Nano that makes replacement a lot more convenient. Lenovo has also returned to using a maximum 170-watt power brick instead of the 230-watt power brick that shipped with a higher-end model since the G4. 20-volt charging maxes out at 100 watts with a regular USB-C charger, although the P1 G7 does support Lenovo's proprietary 20-volt 135-watt chargers that the Z16 and certain Yoga models ship with. But unfortunately, it does not support the latest USB Power Delivery 3.1 charging that features higher voltages that the MacBook Pro and the Framework 16 uses. This is a bit unfortunate since it means you have to use the square power jack for higher power scenarios. Battery life was tested by running an 8-hour 1080p U-log video on YouTube with speakers set at 20% and display at 60Hz with a brightness of 50%. I know, it's not scientific and it's also a bit of a best case scenario, but it's easy to reproduce. Within 1 hour of the video, the system reported an average power draw of 7.375 watts with the battery draining from 100 to 92%. At the end of the 4 hours, the battery drained down from 100% to 37%, with the battery itself reporting an average of 7.4 watt discharge rate. For reference, my Thinkpad X1 Extreme Gen 4 with the same settings drains at an average of 16.5 watts. Keep in mind, however, this is not a fair comparison since my X1 Extreme Gen 4 has the 4K 60Hz IPS display, meaning more pixels that the iGPU has to drive. Not to mention, video playback plays perfectly into the design quirk of Meteor Lake chips where the video decoder is mounted on the chipset tile to prevent waking the entire iGPU for video decode. Disassembly is very easy. 6 Phillips screws hold down the laptop, and only 2 clips towards the back fully hold the bottom cover down. Once removed, you have easy access to the battery, 2 M.2 slots, and the famed LPCAMM2 memory modules, where you can find replacement guides on iFixit in addition to Lenovo's typical hardware maintenance manual. Lenovo has shrunken the cooling solution to a smaller heatsink compared to the giant heat spreader that was always featured in higher spec models from the Gen 4 to the Gen 6, but this also means the P1 Gen 7 always comes with 2 M.2 slots. Lenovo has also dammed the air over the LP CAM modules and opened up one of the sides of the fans to draw air over the heatsink in the memory. The Core Ultra 7 has a pre-configured max boost of 115 watts in the BIOS, but in Cinebench R23, this only hits a max of 105 watts and immediately settles down to about 75 watts over time. GPU power draw will go up to 80 watts stated in the NVIDIA control panel under load with the best performance setting. In certain games, I got a total reported system power draw of 144 watts. In terms of internals, one can actually claim the P1 G7 to be a side grade over its 6th gen predecessor. Being limited to LPCAMM2 means your maximum memory drops down from 96 gigabytes in 2x48 gigabyte modules to only 64 gigabytes, although LPCAMM2 does reach faster speeds of LPDDR5. You technically get a CPU generational uplift, but Raptor Lake to Meteor Lake doesn't gain you that much performance, and the GPU options actually take a hit with the P1 G7 maxing out at the RTX 4070 mobile at 60 watts, while the P1 G6 offered up to an RTX 4090 mobile at 80 watts. As mentioned before, though, on a higher performance mode, the P1 G7's GPU will boost to the full 80 watt power. A mystery, at least to me, is if Lenovo has removed the mux switch. My Thinkpad X1 Extreme Gen 4, for example, features an option in the BIOS to switch between hybrid graphics Optimus and discrete graphics. The P1 Gen 7 does not have that, and even though in the PSREF Lenovo claims it has advanced Optimus, the NVIDIA control panel says otherwise. In the PSREF, Lenovo does add an OTA after Advanced Optimus. If the OTA refers to over the air, it's possible this is a feature not available at launch, but available via a future BIOS or driver update. If that was the case, however, it might be better to just wait until the GA comes around, since if Lenovo had to rush this out before fully integrating all the drivers, well, I don't think somebody who wants to buy a ThinkPad wants a Tesla-esque experience to the drivers and the software. At the end of the day, the P1 G7 is heresy to a ThinkPad purist. However, I'll also make the argument that if you're a ThinkPad purist, you would never purchase something from the P1 or the X1 Extreme family in the first place. For a long time but more casual ThinkPad user like me, the form factor is nice, the track point is still usable, even with the haptic trackpad, and you have enough I/O to only need to carry an Ethernet dongle. However, despite this being the first ever device to feature LPCAMM2, the exclusivity of the memory modules and the soldering of the power jack makes this device feel like a downgrade in repairability. LPCAMM2 isn't the silver bullet. Just because memory is replaceable doesn't mean it's upgradable. With SODIMM, you can always swap it down to another computer, but with LPCAMM2, well, you better make sure you have something higher end that has a memory module that's worth replacing and even supports it in the first place. It's not all bad news, however. By sacrificing on the cooling solution and moving to LPCAMM2, Lenovo guarantees 2 M.2 slots on all P1 G7s, whereas previously you only had the second M.2 slot on lower end configurations that had less powerful GPUs. The P1 G7 is definitely a device more designed to appeal to the masses. Moving to a haptic trackpad means more space for people who aren't accustomed to a pointing stick, and the shrunken form factor feels like an attempt to close in on the travesty that's the new XPS 16, but with a real keyboard and usable I/O. On its own, the P1 G7 is not a bad laptop if you're looking for something with a premium design, but the high price is out of reach for most people, and a similarly spec'd gaming laptop costs far less for similar, if not better, performance. If you want to get the P1 G7 for the novelty of the first device with LPCAMM2 memory, maybe buy a Framework 16 instead. It's not as powerful in the GPU department, but it's definitely a more interesting laptop with some fun quirks. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment whether I'm too lenient on Lenovo for the travesty that's the new P1, or did Lenovo nail it with the new design changes? Let me know your thoughts.